Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's Game of Thrones book-to-show comparison for Season 2. This video is part of a series of videos where I talk about the things I thought the show did better than the books, and the things I thought the books did better than the show. I'm not one of these people that think every tiny little change the show makes from the books is a great offense to the gods. In fact, I do believe that sometimes the show can actually improve upon the material in the books. But in other cases, it can fail to adapt the storyline properly and fumble it up. So I'm going to name my top 5 things that the show did better than the books, and my top 5 things I felt the books did better than the show. If you haven't read the books, not to worry, this video doesn't contain spoilers of anything that hasn't been revealed yet in the show, but it does highlight the differences between the show and the books, and to avoid show spoilers, it would help if you've seen up to Season 3. So let's start with my top 5 things that the show did better than the books in Season 2. Number 5 is the Battle of Blackwater. Now, before I read the book, someone had told me that the Battle of Blackwater was much better in the books because there was this giant chain that Tyrion used, and there was a wall of crashed ships that people were fighting on, and it was so much better than what happened in the show. So first of all, I think anyone who expected to see this in the show has some serious misunderstandings of the size of a budget a television show has. To pull something off like this would be far beyond what any TV show could afford. In fact, I was really impressed that the show managed to pull off what it did. In fact, I was completely blown away by the scope of the battle, as this is something I expect to see in a Lord of the Rings movie. Secondly, when I read the book, I actually felt the battle was better in the show. Now, it's a possibility that my friend was biased towards the book because he read it first, and it's a possibility I was biased towards the show because I saw it first, but to me, what made this battle so great was being able to see it from so many different perspectives. To see Bronn and the Hound go at it, to see Stannis fighting in the trenches, and all the different interactions that are outside the perspective of viewpoint characters, because in the books, the only viewpoint characters involved in the battle were Tyrion, Sansa, and Davos. Sansa is just hiding with the women and children the whole time, so we don't actually see any of the battle through her eyes, and Davos gets blown off his boat towards the very beginning of the battle. So basically in the books we see a great majority of the battle through Tyrion's eyes, and in the show it was great to see outside that perspective. For example, that scene at the end of the battle where Cersei's about to poison Tommen, and you get this montage of everything falling apart, and then Tywin bursts through the doors with the Tyrells declaring victory. That was amazing, and to me it was far more emotionally powerful than it was portrayed in the book. So I'd say this was an improvement on what was in the books. Number 4 is Tyrion cleaning house in King's Landing. This happened in both the books and the show, but the way the show did seemed more spectacular and a lot more witty. Some of these scenes, like the one where Tyrion is banning Janos Slynt to the wall and Tyrion arresting Pycelle, were similar to the books, but I felt the show succeeded in making these scenes much more fun to watch, and Tyrion came off as far more witty. In the books, he was kind of just doing his father's bidding because Tywin didn't like that Janos Slynt was from a minor house and didn't think he deserved to be a lord, whereas in the show, Tyrion could just see what a worthless piece of crap Slynt was for betraying Ned like that and didn't want him anywhere near him, and that was so much more effective, and this scene so much more satisfying. And more importantly, the scene where Tyrion told Pycelle, Littlefinger, and Varys 3 different stories on where he was sending Myrcella in order to find out who would betray him was so much more effective in the show, because in the books he didn't even necessarily tell 3 different stories, he just let it slip, and he did it gradually over time, whereas in the show he told the 3 of them, the 3 different stories back to back, and it was even edited in this really cool way where it was made into one conversation that just flowed right into the next. It was really awesome to behold. Number 3 is Robb Stark's storyline. Before I'd read the books, I had looked at Robb Stark as one of the main characters of the show, and this is a character I think book readers and show watchers have very different opinions on. I've heard the argument put forward by book loralists that making Robb Stark a more important character in the show was unnecessary, but I completely disagree. In fact, I felt it was much better that he was a more important character in the show. For one thing, it made the Red Wedding much more effective, and in the show Robb Stark was a major player, and the possibility that he could win the War of the Five Kings was something audience members were really rooting for. Plus, I really liked how they changed his storyline in regards to breaking his marriage oath with Walder Frey and marrying someone else. As in the books, he married the daughter of a Lannister bannerman named Jane Westerly, whereas in the show he married a doctor from Volantis named Talisa Madri. In the books, he married because he slept with her and it was the honorable thing to do, but in the show, he married because he fell in love. And I have to say, I felt the way the show did it was so much better. Some liked it in the books that he married because it was the honorable thing to do, so it showed that he had the same flaw as Ned Stark and this was his downfall, but keeping his promise to marry Walder's daughter was also the honorable thing to do, so his decision to marry Jane just came off as stupid and showed how inexperienced he was, whereas in the show, they did an excellent job of showing the romance between Robb and Talisa and how he was conflicted but eventually decided it was best to follow his heart. In fact, we saw this storyline play out in many other movies, and it typically works out well for the lovers in question. So the way the show did it was great because it put a real twist on the marrying for love, because in the world of Game of Thrones, following your heart isn't always the best thing to do, and I love how that played out. Number 2 is Arya's storyline. Now, I was tempted to split this into 2 categories because really it is, but I wanted to leave room for other entries in my top 5. There's 2 things about Arya's storyline in Season 2 I thought they did far better in the books. One being her relationship with Jaqen H'ghar, and the other being her relationship with Tywin Lannister. So let's tackle the Jaqen H'ghar one first. In the show, they were a bit more close than they were in the books. Although it was very similar to how it was portrayed in the books, I felt they really upplayed their friendship in the show, which I really liked. But mainly it's her choices for the 3 deaths Jaqen granted her that I thought played out much better in the show. People who watched the show thought she wasted the 3 deaths, but it was much more of a waste in the books. Her first death was some Lannister soldier she overheard telling a horrible story about how he and a group of the Mountain's men gang raped a tavern wench. And her second choice was the man who is in charge of overseeing her, who is cruel to her. And her third choice was to trick Jaqen H'ghar into helping her free the Bolton soldiers so they could take over Harrenhal. Now, the third choice was the most wasted one because that was the Bolton soldiers' plan all along. Anyway, they were working with the brave companions in order to fool the Lannister men and take over Harrenhal, so she wasn't even necessary for her to free them. So she essentially wasted a death wish. Plus, it didn't even get her out of Harrenhal. It just made Roose Bolton the new master of Harrenhal, and he treated her almost as badly as the Lannisters did. And the first 2 wishes were wasted as well, and were just petty grudges. She even realized after she made the second wish that it was a total waste. Whereas in the show, her 3 death wishes were more understandable. Her first one being the Tickler, whom she saw torture innocent people to death, and who nearly killed her friend Gendry. And plus, she wasn't sure if Jaqen would actually kill someone for her, so she kind of was just testing the waters. Her second wish was Sir Armory Lorch, who had discovered her with a scroll that she shouldn't have had, so she was in danger of being ratted out to Tywin, who would have possibly killed her or worse, so that wish was a total necessity. And her third wish actually got her and her friends out of Harrenhal, so unlike the books, it was actually effective and not a waste. So the other thing about Arya's storyline was her relationship with Tywin, which was absolutely awesome. It helped expand upon Tywin's character, who at this point in the show we had barely seen, so it helped develop him, and seeing his interactions with Arya were simply amazing. There was also that level of tension that he would discover who she really was, and seeing them verbally spar made for some great television, whereas in the books it was Roose Bolton who took over Harrenhal and made her his cupbearer, and this was a lot less interesting to me, and it also seemed really strange that someone who was a bannerman for her family would be such a villain and treat her like shit. I mean, you figure if it was a bannerman of her family, she'd feel really comfortable enough to reveal her true identity. Yes, we know now what kind of villain Roose Bolton is, but it made it far too obvious that he would betray Robb by having him be this evil guy from the get-go. It never sat right with me, whereas having it be Tywin, who was already her family's mortal enemy, made much more sense to me. And the number one thing I thought the show did better than the books in Season 2 was Daenerys' storyline. To me, this is a no-brainer. In fact, I might even go as far to say that this was the best change the show has ever made from the books during its entire run thus far. Daenerys' storyline in Season 2 was infinitely more interesting than it was in A Clash of Kings. It's impossible to articulate. In the show, there was actually a story involved in Daenerys' story arc. There was an actual narrative structure. In the books, there was no narrative structure, no stakes. Daenerys and her group just come across some people from Karth, and they go there and they have a good time, and eventually Dany visits the House of the Undying, where they try to take her dragon, so she burns it to the ground, and then they leave. It was frankly incredibly boring, and it didn't raise the stakes or change Daenerys' character at all. Whereas in the show, her storyline this year was amazing and one of my favorites that the show has ever done. It starts out with her people starving and dying of thirst in the Red Waste. They can't go in any other direction because someone will kill her and take her dragons. So her horses start to die, people start to starve to death, and the situation is so bad, she gets so desperate that she sends 3 riders off in 3 different directions. One comes back missing a head, the other doesn't come back at all, but the third one returns and says there's this great city that's promised to take them in. So they travel all the way to that city where there's this guy being a huge dick, and he threatens to close the gates on them, which would mean certain death from them all, but this other guy, Zarazon Doxos, lets them in, but you can tell something's really up with him. He has this hidden agenda, and once they're in the city, Daenerys has a few verbal sparring matches with the Spice King character, who I have to say is my favorite show original character in the entire series, who is witty as fuck and puts her in her place. Then Daenerys gets a marriage proposal from Zarazon Doxos, and Daenerys is caught with deciding who to be dependent on, Zarazon Doxo, the Spice King, or Jorah, who's off looking for a boat for her. But then her dragons are stolen, which is tense as fuck, and she's screaming, "Where are my dragons?" And then you discover the dragons were stolen by Peret Pri, head of the Warlocks, who made a deal with Zarazon Doxos where they kill off the rest of the rulers of Karth and make him the king of Karth. In return, Peret Pri gets Dany's dragons, and he tries to lure Dany into a trap where he can keep her captive forever so her dragons will flourish, but her magic is greater than his, and her dragons end up toasting him alive. Then they go find Zarazon Doxos and her handmaiden who had betrayed her, and they lock him up in his stupid vault forever. Then they totally, trash Karth and steal all the shit that they need in order to buy a boat. I mean, this was so much more awesome, so much more exciting, a lot of twists and turns, a lot of high stakes. Will Dany die? Will she live? How will she get out of it? And most of all, it served her character development purpose of bringing Dany to realize she need not be dependent on others and is strong enough to fend for herself. This is a great narrative structure, and I applaud the showrunners for making such a great story out of what was a flat and boring story in the books. Okay, so now let me get to my top 5 things I felt the books did better than the show in Season 2. So these are examples of how the show failed to adapt the books properly. We'll start with my number 5, the lack of river run in the show. In the books, Edmure and Blackfish were introduced in the first book, played major roles in the first 4 books. In fact, I think it's fair to say in the books, Edmure Tully was featured more than Robb Stark. Although I don't mind that was changed, it did kind of bother me that they weren't introduced until Season 3 in this show. As someone who hadn't read the books at the time, it came off like these two guys just popped out of nowhere. Well, I can see why they were left out of season 1, as there was too much other stuff going on. I see no reason why they were left out of season 2. In fact, I think it would have made much more sense for them to go to Riverrun and bring Jaime there and that be their base camp rather than some random camp in the middle of nowhere. It might not have made much sense in a geographical terms, but let's be honest here, the show has always disregarded that anyway. But it would have been better in having a solid set, and more importantly, to introduce Edmure and Blackfish into the story gradually rather than just having them appear out of nowhere in season 3, where you felt the only reason they were introduced is so that they could have the Red Wedding. Number 4 is the House of the Undying. So I stand by what I said about Daenerys' storyline being far superior in the show as it was in the books. However, that being said, there were a few details I had issues with in the show. For one, Parrot Pre being the only warlock in the show made it seem like he was just this one dude there hanging out at the House of the Undying all by himself. Whereas in the books, they made it clear there was a whole bunch of warlocks, and in the show, Karth seems like this tiny little two-horse town with, everyone saying, oh, this is the greatest city that ever was or will be, but really no one's there when Dany just totally trashes the place at the end. Whereas in the books, he was portrayed as a huge city with not only the Council of the 13, but they also had a trade guild, and the warlocks was a major force, and there's this huge docks with tons of ships. But most of all, the House of the Undying scene in the books, which had much more mystery, and it was much more weird and hinted at many prophecies and things to come, like Rhaegar and the Song of Ice and Fire, and it even hinted at the Red Wedding. The books also made it clear that she was seeing all these weird visions. This was not so clear in the show, and when I first saw it, I thought it was just Parrot Pre fucking with her, with her mind to try to get her to stay behind. Instead of it being prophecies, I thought he was just showing her stuff to make her stay at the House of the Undying. Like the thing with Khal Drogo, that seemed to be in order to trick her to stay with him so Parrot Pre could have her trapped there forever. That being said, I do think the prophecies put in the show were put there for a reason and are indicators of what will happen later in the show. I just felt this was handled so much better in the books. Number 3 is the Burning of Wintertell. Okay, when I first watched this episode, which was well before I read the books, I was so confused as to how the hell Winterfell got burned down. I was angry. I was really angry. This made no freaking sense. Okay, so in the show, Theon took over Winterfell, but only had about 20 men and were surrounded by Robb Stark's bannermen who were blowing horns in order to freak him out. I remember seeing a scene with this dude who was Robb Stark's advisor, whom I now know is Roose Bolton, but at the time I had no idea who this guy was. He was just some random guy for all I knew. Anyway, this random advisor dude told Robb that his son could retake Winterfell for him, and Robb told him to offer to let the Ironborn go free as long as they surrendered Theon to them. So next we see Theon make this grand speech about dying in battle, but the other Ironborn just, knock him out and drag his body away. So you assume they took Theon to the random dude's son in order to make a deal to be set free by giving up Theon. Okay, so I missed the part about Winterfell being burned to the ground. What the fuck sense does that make? How did Winterfell get burned to the ground in all this? Are we meant to think that the Ironborn did it? The whole point was to surrender Theon to the Stark Bannermen so they would be set free. Do they really expect to be set free if they frickin' burn Winterfell to the ground? Or are we expected to believe that the Stark Bannermen, who we now know are actually Bolton men led by Ramsay Snow, were the ones who did it? Who, at the time, show watchers have no idea who this character is, let alone how despicable he is. First off, the show did nothing to establish Ramsay at this point or how horrible a man he is, so to expect anyone to know who hasn't read the books to get why he would burn Winterfell to the ground is stupid. And secondly, even knowing what an evil bastard he is, why would he burn Winterfell to the ground? What would he possibly gain by doing so? Whereas in the books, it was clear Ramsay burned Winterfell to the ground, and it was clear even at this stage what kind of monster he was, and it was clear why he would want to burn Winterfell to the ground, because Sir Roderick, under Stark orders, tried to have him killed. Some people complained about the fact that Ramsay was left out of season 2, but I don't mind that so much, as I can kind of see why it would be confusing for show watchers to have him in the show, and it would take far too much time to explain. But the way that they handled the burning of Winterfell made no freaking sense. Number 2 is related to number 3, and that is Theon's storyline. In the books, Theon's plot to take over Winterfell was presented as a clever ploy, and his downfall came in trusting the random prisoner who we learned was Ramsay. And Ramsay tricked and betrayed him in order to defeat both the Starks and the Ironborn. Whereas in the show, Theon was portrayed as a moron who came up with a stupid plan to take Winterfell because he was just too whiny to just attack fishing towns, and he was being played by his subordinates that were talking him into doing all these things, and eventually betrayed him. And all the while, he was just acting like a whiny idiot. The way he threatened Yara and her men were ready to kick his ass. I mean, overall, he just came off a lot more whiny and idiotic than he did in the books, and I just had no time for him in the show. Whereas in the books, he was actually an interesting character who was easier to understand and relate to. And my number one thing that the books did better than the show in season 2 is Jon Snow's storyline. Overall, when I first watched the first 2 seasons, I didn't like Jon Snow at all, or the Wall storyline, and the Wall storyline was definitely my least favorite storyline in the show. However, when I read the books, I really liked Jon Snow, and I found the Wall storyline rather interesting. Part of the reason why is due to something I brought up in my season 1 video, that the show aged Jon Snow up, but still had him act like a 14-year-old. So in the books it made sense he'd be acting this way, but in the show he came off as a pansy and an idiot. His season 2 storyline was particularly bad, however, when he left on a mission with Qhorin Halfhand and stumbled across Ygritte. Qhorin left him alone with Ygritte so he could kill her, but he couldn't bring himself to do it, so instead he ended up getting lost from Qhorin and the others, and eventually Ygritte fucked with his head and led him into a trap. When Jon was reunited with Qhorin Halfhand, he told him his men were killed and he was taken prisoner, all because they were looking for Jon's dumbass as he got himself tricked by Ygritte. What an incompetent douchebag. Whereas in the books, Jon couldn't bring himself to kill Ygritte either, but instead of getting tricked and captured by her, she simply got away, and Jon remained with Qhorin Halfhand. His men, through no fault of Jon's, were killed by wildlings, and when they were camped that night, Qhorin even told Jon that he understood why he left Ygritte alive. And in fact, the reason he left Ygritte and Jon alone was to test Jon and see whether or not he killed her. So it even implied that he approved of Jon's decision. Through no fault of their own, Jon and Qhorin were cornered by the wildlings and taken prisoner. This was so much better than the way the show did it. I really liked that not even was Jon not stupid and tricked by letting Ygritte live, Qhorin Halfhand even understood why. Whereas in the show, Jon was, begging Qhorin Halfhand to take him with him on this mission, and apparently it was a huge mistake because he just got him and his men killed because he was such an incompetent moron. That made me hate Jon Snow even more than I already did, whereas in the books, I thought he was awesome. So that's it for my Game of Thrones Season 2 book to show comparison. Check out my channel for many other Game of Thrones reviews, and make sure you subscribe to keep up with the book to show comparisons for the other seasons I'll be doing. And thanks a lot for watching.